Please wait for this.
Good afternoon and welcome to today's Link Senior webinar. Just a few housekeeping items before we begin. Today's webinar is providing one free NAB, NCAP, and NCCDP CEU credit. To be eligible for the CEU credits today, you must stay on the webinar for the full hour. At the end of the webinar, I will provide the required post-webinar survey evaluation link in the webinar room chat box. And I will also be sending that survey link to you through a constant contact email message. Please be sure to check your email spam folder. You must fill out the survey no later than midnight this Friday, June 25th, to be eligible for the CEU credit. And even if you are not looking for CEU credit today, we still want your feedback, so please go ahead and fill out the survey as well. The PDF today's PowerPoint deck will be in the email that I send via constant contact later today, and CEU certificates will be issued by email on Friday. Again, please be sure to check your spam folder. And now I'm going to hand it over to Charles Diesel-Morin, the CEO and co-founder of Link Senior.
Great, thank you, Megan. So good afternoon, everyone, or good morning for some of you, but thank you for joining today's webinar. Extremely excited to have Jennifer Brush come back. As you might remember, she did a webinar for us late last year. So very excited to have her back. Great update on some of her work and the importance of how we can create supportive environments for the older adults in our society and people living with dementia. So I'll take just a few minutes to give you a little bit of background on these webinars. As some of you might know, we started these about a year and a half ago, profoundly driven by our passion to change the experience of the older adult, but also understanding that that comes through a better empowered frontline staff, or staff like you that shows up at work every day to increase the quality of the life of the older adults, but sometimes doesn't have the resources to access quality education. We've done many webinars and have attracted almost 5,000 people, and the topics really range widely from music and memory to things that are very compliance-driven, to Nancy Ewald, the founder of Activity Connection. But the idea is really to share best practices and what we see as foremost, the best things going on today in resident engagement. And that also serves as a invitation. We hear a lot of your comments and would love to hear also, as we've done in the past, about what you would like us to put forward. So if you can think of people that you think we should highlight in our webinars, please do so. A little bit about Link Senior itself. As Megan mentioned, I'm the CEO and co-founder. What we do is we provide a resident engagement platform. So in other words, we build tools and best practices and technology to help people like you engage the residents under your care in the most person-centered manner. We're based in Washington, D.C., and we're very excited that one of the cool updates that we have for you guys today is the research that we've mentioned probably before a little bit to you. We're about to be published. We did a year-long study funded by Baycrest in Canada in the memory care and long-term care setting with a sample of almost 300 residents and saw amazing results. So the big update is actually we're going to be published in September, which feels obviously great for us and our partners. With that, I'd like to take us into today's agenda. So first of all, as you might see, we changed platform. We went to GoToMeeting to Zoom, and the point is, for the Q&A section of today's agenda, please make sure that you know where the chat feature is, and that will allow you to ask questions throughout the presentation and at the end, so we can ask these questions to Jennifer and make sure you get the answers to what you're wondering. So with that, I'll get into the agenda of today's presentation. What I'd like to do is set the stage for Jennifer by explaining a little bit the need for better resident engagement, and focus a little bit on why we think that techniques and best practices and the work of people such as Jennifer is so important for us to at least consider as an organization. And then obviously we'll set the stage. Once the stage is set, Jennifer will go on and we'll leave about 5–10 minutes for questions and answers and wrapping up at the end. So with that, again, it's my pleasure to talk a little bit about Jennifer. She is, the biggest thing for me when I met Jennifer is, beyond her deep passion for advancing the life of the older adults, especially people living with dementia, is her high level of expertise in everything that relates to creating adaptive environments and her experience around Montessori. I would also highlight that in the US, there is only one AMI certified educator, and that is Jennifer. So it's exciting to really hear about those best practices from that person. Here's a slide about me. As I mentioned, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Link Senior. I think we can skip that. Going forward, what I'd like to do is discuss a little bit, where we are in terms of resident engagement, share with you what we're seeing, and put that in context for Jennifer. I don't know if you've heard a little bit about this concept of social determinants of health. I'd like to explain that a little bit because it's highly relevant to what we do as social worker, activity director, nurses, anyone working in the senior care space today, which is that all research in the past 4 to 5 years have led to the fact of a general conclusion that the outcomes, that means the measurable quality of life indicators of someone that goes through a healthcare journey, more than 70% of these outcomes are not clinical or medical based, but psychosocial in nature. So what this means for us, 2 things. One, it doesn't mean that the medical piece is not important. That is the reason why people come to us in the first place. But if someone is working in the field of resident engagement, that means that we have a huge opportunity to increase the quality of life of our residents, up to 70%, 70, which is huge. And Jennifer's work around the environment also comes into play here. And also, one would argue that these 2 things, or these other things, are probably not respected, judged, and valued as much. So one would argue today that anything that relates to increasing the quality of life of our residents through non-medical and non-clinical things in nature have a big potential for years to come, which is exciting. I think that when we think about our work, this idea of person-centered care, every person that works in activities and life enrichment today probably is driven by one thing, which is to help our residents find purpose and help people, as Abraham Maslow meant, be who they must be. And in the context of our residents living with dementia, I think it's interesting that we still live in the world where a lot of our organization cannot answer simple questions, such as, are we actually engaging everyone? We talk to hundreds of organizations throughout the weeks, the months, the years, and we still find people that are not giving their frontline tools, frontline staff tools to be able to address these simple questions, such as, 1, are we engaging everyone? 2, are we engaging people based on their needs and preferences? And 3, are we thinking about well-being and outcomes? If you believe that you or your organization are inspired to do more of this, I think it's interesting to recognize the fact that resident engagement is tough. You've probably seen this slide from our past webinars. We love to repeat these because it basically explains why an activity director, a rec therapist, a life enrichment job is, one would argue sometimes almost impossible, which leads to some of the sad standards that we know across our industry today. These numbers are from 2015. We know they've increased, but not that much. But I think this also speaks about the opportunity for us to do better and more, and provide more engagement, more person-centered engagement to our residents. And at Link Senior, and I'll finish with two last slides, at Link Senior, we're very passionate about what the staff is trying to do in terms of process, which is ultimately to think about how can we prescribe engagement for our residents, right? We all know that, for example, music for music therapy often, if not always, is better than antipsychotic medication or antidepressants. So how can we create such world? So in the end, you'll get a survey, and we welcome the opportunity to talk to your organization. And with that, I'd love to introduce again Jennifer, and have, maybe we can change the slide, and have her share her best practices when it comes to creating these environments that really maximize the quality of the life of the residents, of the older adults and the residents that we serve, whether they have dementia or not, but obviously with bigger impact with people living with dementia. Jennifer, I'll leave it up to you and remind you that you just need to prompt us so that we can advance the slides for you. Thank you.
Great, thank you. It's great to be here today. Thank you everybody for joining us to talk about the environment. I really see the environment as an untapped resource. So many people forget to consider how the environment can support older adults and people with dementia. And the environment does need to be different for older adults. If you could switch to the next slide, please. So we're going to talk today about why older adults need a special kind of environment and what you can do from very small, low-cost things, changes that you can make in your day-to-day practice that can make a difference to help people be more independent. Next slide, please. When we're looking at the environment, I think that most of the changes that we're making to the environment are because of sensory changes that older adults are experiencing. There's a number of sensory changes that are just very normal that happen because we age. And then there are additional sensory changes that people with dementia experience. So I'd like to go through some of these so we can kind of set the stage for why we're making the changes that we make. There's a lot of research in this area. We really know and understand the changes that people experience. We know what the best design features are to support these. And we know that when we make these changes, when we have a properly designed environment, that people function much, much better. So just as a part of normal aging, our pupil size decreases. And that really limits the amount of light that the retina receives. So a typical 60-year-old only receives about 1/3 of the retinal illuminance of a 20-year-old. So that's just a healthy person. And I know, I'm in my 50s. I know when I was in my 40s, I started having trouble reading menus in darker restaurants. Driving at night sometimes is difficult for me. Our pupil also doesn't react as quickly when we're shifting from bright areas to dark areas or vice versa. So that means if someone's outside in the bright light and they're walking inside to an area that may not be lit as brightly, their pupils need time to react. They're going to adjust more slowly than a younger person's eyes. We need to allow for that. There's a loss of elasticity in the lens that makes it difficult to shift your focus to accommodate from looking at something near and then looking at something far. That's why many of us, when we're in our 40s and 50s, start needing reading glasses. Okay? There's a thickening and actually a yellowing of the lens that occurs. And we find that healthy older adults have a reduced sense of contrast and a reduced sense of color saturation. There's also a variety of low vision issues that they're dealing with, and a reduced ability not to discriminate, not to see blue, but to discriminate among different types of blue values, blue greens, blue purples. So there's a slight typo there on that slide that I just noticed. Next slide, please. People with dementia also have difficulties with depth perception. So they're going to have trouble judging how far away something is from them. You might see someone picking up a glass and taking a drink and putting it down in their food in their plate by mistake. That's not because they're confused, it's because they're having trouble judging distances. So that makes it difficult really getting around the community and even just performing regular activities of daily living. There's also spatial disorientation, difficulty judging colors, and difficulty judging contrast. So we find that older adults need more contrast and more color to differentiate objects from one another, and people with dementia need even more assistance with colors and contrast. And so we'll talk in a little while about how that translates into what we do in the physical environment. Next slide, please. There's also hearing changes that are very common as a result of aging, sensory neural hearing loss in the high frequencies, but there's also hearing changes that happen because of dementia. And so there is an association between hearing impairment and dementia. Studies have found that hearing impairment contributes to cognitive dysfunction. We know that the relationship between auditory and cognitive processing has long been recognized as important. There is significant evidence that auditory processing disorders may predict and accelerate the onset of cognitive disorders such as dementia. And if you think about a shared residential setting for older adults, that inability to process speech in noisy backgrounds is a big problem. When that's compounded by a decline in central auditory nervous system in people with Alzheimer's disease or other dementias, it makes it very difficult to communicate. So, think about your environment and the noise levels in your environment. When I go to a community for consulting and I do an environmental assessment, I actually bring a sound level meter with me and really objectively judge the sounds. But, think about a dining situation. You have a group of people, they're talking louder, so they're heard over each other. If you're playing music in the background, you are compounding that noise. You're adding to the background noise, and people with dementia have a very difficult time filtering out irrelevant stimuli in the environment. So we really need to think about anything that we can do to reduce the amount of noise so communication is better. Next slide, please. Other sensory changes, taste and smell changes. I do a lot of work with people with dementia living in their homes. I see a lot of spoiled food in refrigerators that they can't tell because of visual problems and reduced sense of smell. They can't tell that it's spoiled. So we have reduced sensitivity to taste often as we age. And in addition, as we age, our mouth produces less saliva, and medications that older adults take result in dry mouth. And this is your first level of digestion. So it's difficult for people sometimes to break down food. You always want to give someone something to drink. Start the meal off with something to drink first before they're eating anything, and certainly provide things to drink all throughout the day. But we see that things that are very, very strong in flavor often are very sweet things, very sugary things, chocolates, ice creams, people are attracted to because their sense of taste and smell is declining. And our sense of smell is most of our sense of taste. I mean, you know how I have a cold right now, nothing seems to taste good because I can't smell anything. So that's something to be aware of as well. And next slide, please. And older adults also experience some changes in peripheral sensations. So there's a slight decline in peripheral nerve function that controls the sense of touch. So you may, people may tell you that they have trouble feeling on the tips of their fingers, that you may see people dropping utensils or dropping things that they pick up. They can still certainly perceive pain. That is something that is preserved. Although what we find often in people with dementia is that they're unable to communicate that they're in pain. So it's something that is often undiagnosed or misdiagnosed or missed in people with dementia. You may have someone tell you that they can't feel their feet on the floor. That's also a sensation change that we see very often. Next slide, please. So we know that we can make very simple, low-cost environmental interventions and make a difference with outcomes. I've done studies that have looked at improving outcomes such as intake during meals. We know that environmental interventions can also improve communication between residents and staff and help staff develop meaningful relationships with residents. Next slide. So when I am doing an assessment of an individual, I'm interested in both their capacity and their performance. So their capacity is what somebody can do in an optimal setting, okay? And then performance is what they actually do. So capacity is what you can do. Performance is what they do outside of that optimal setting. And what we want to do is tweak that environment so that their performance is as close to their capacity as possible. Next slide. So I just want to mention a very widely known model that was developed by Powell Lawton in the 1970s that examines the role of the environment on performance. It's referred to as the competence press model. And it suggests that an individual has a certain amount of competence or capacity across several domains, so physical, cognitive, emotional, and that the environment, both the physical and the social environment, exerts demands or what we call press on the individual, which affects his behavior. So how an individual copes is a function of the match between their competencies and the press of the environment. So when there's a match between a person's competencies and the demands of the environment, the individual is very well adapted. If the environment exerts significantly more press than a person's competencies, okay, they'll experience negative adaptation. They're not going to manage well. Conversely, when environmental demands are significantly lower than competencies, you'll also have negative adaptation. So if we put this in the context of dementia, if you have an environment, a long-term care environment, a home environment, any environment, external, you take them to a shopping mall, you have an environment that is exerting too much press, then they can adapt to. They're going to become anxious. They may become very agitated. They'll become stressed out. They might leave. They might try and exit the environment. They might hit, they might yell, they might totally shut down and really retreat within themselves. So you're going to see all of these negative adaptations if you don't have an environment, if you have an environment that's exerting too much press. Now, if you look at an environment that doesn't have enough press, which is what I find is often the situation in long-term care, there is not a engaging program that gives them a way to engage in their previous life roles and choose activities that are a cognitive match to their abilities and that they're not available all of the time, so that you have an environment that is then does not have enough press. And then you see all of those things that I just mentioned that you see when the environment exerts too much press. So, excuse me. Sorry, I'm trying to get over a cold today. So I really believe that so much of what's labeled in long-term care as challenging behaviors or responsive behaviors is because of either too much press or not enough press in the environment, and it's causing negative adaptation. Next slide, please. Because of this, several years ago, my colleagues and I had a grant from the National Institutes of Health, specifically funded by the National Institute of Deafness and Other Communication Disorders. And we developed an assessment tool for long-term care that allows you to look at the physical environment and determine what aspects of the environment are either serving as barriers or facilitators, specifically to communication for people with dementia. Next slide, please. And we saw that in long-term care, there were a lot of barriers that were really very easy fixes. There was low light levels, poor contrast in the environment, small print, and that we could turn those into facilitators very easily by improving wayfinding cues, providing cues that were high contrast, making large print labels and signs, really simple interventions. Next slide, please. So a little summary before we get into the specific design strategies that I recommend. Just some overall summary of some research that's been done. We know that when you serve food family or buffet style, that it's associated with reduced waste and less reliance on dietary supplements. We've also seen in the research that people with dementia who eat with their caregivers have better weight gain and better food intake. There's also an increased awareness by the staff and improved working conditions for the staff. One of my favorite places where I worked, we always sat down at lunchtime with the residents. We weren't up moving around the room. We were sitting down with them, eating with them, building a relationship with them. There's a significant relationship between satisfaction, improved satisfaction, and not serving people on trays anymore. And we found that when the dining room is also used for a multi-purpose room, there really needs to be a lot of redundant cueing in the environment to remind the residents that it's time to eat. And I'll show you some examples of what I mean by cueing in just a little while. Next slide, please. If you look at the research on incontinence, the environment also affects incontinence. So we have the environment having a big role on mealtime. Also, we know that 50 to 65% of nursing home residents are incontinent, and the design of the bathroom has been cited as one of the major contributors to incontinence. So we know that when you can see the toilet, when it is in line of sight, especially in line of sight of the bed, it's used more frequently. There's less incontinence. We know that falls in bedrooms are attributed to poor lighting in the rooms, poor surfaces, bad grab bar locations. And a lot of these falls are people getting out of bed going to use the bathroom. Bathrooms should always have extra lighting. They should always have night lights. There should be a light over the toilet or by the toilet to really aid in finding the bathroom and the toilet at nighttime. We find lots of people get up at night, and it really is a big contributor to falls. Next, please. We also know that contrast in the bathroom is essential. At a very minimum, you should paint the wall behind the toilet and the sink a contrasting color. So if I would say 99% of the bathrooms that I go into in long-term care are all beige. And when things are all beige or all white and just blend together because of the depth perception issues, contrast issues, color issues, low vision, people with dementia have a very, very hard time finding the toilet, finding the sink, finding their shower. And then when you have personal items on the countertop that just blend, for instance, a beige countertop with a white toothbrush, it makes it very, very difficult for them to be independent. So in projects, communities that work with me, we always pick a pretty saturated, rather bright color for the wall behind the toilet and the sink. And we make sure that the toilet paper and the towels and everything really contrast from that so they jump out. Next, please. And I'll show you examples of this. I have pictures of everything that I'm talking about. So let's get into some of the design guidelines and strategies. I have them organized into 3 main strategies. So optimizing cognitive aspects of the environment, optimizing visual aspects of the environment, and some of those overlap a little bit with cognitive, and then optimizing auditory aspects of the environment. So those are really, those 3 design strategies compensate for those sensory losses that we talked about earlier. Next slide, please. So the first design strategy is optimizing cognitive aspects of the environment. One way to do that is with cues or signs, and another way to do that is personalizing spaces and materials. What you choose to put on signs is very important. I did a pilot study that was sponsored by the National Institutes of Health, and I showed a variety of different types of signs, colors, icons, wording to people with dementia. And one thing that I learned from this study is that the icons that you use and the words that you use really do make a difference. Everywhere in public, we see this man and woman stick figure in a wheelchair for a restroom sign. Okay? Very, very popular. But when I specifically asked people with dementia to choose between the 2 pictures and what they preferred, most of them picked a picture of a toilet. And when I talked to them about it, they said things to me like, it says what it is. I know what it means. I know that's for me. I know what it is. So they really, the pictures that we use need to be concrete. And I'm a big one for testing everything and not making any assumptions at all. You also want your signs to be high contrast. So you can see the sign on the left, the gray sign, it does not have the contrast that the red and white sign does. Next. Personalizing spaces. We see a lot of people walking, looking for their rooms in spaces that aren't very personalized. Often hallways all look the same. Okay? These polka dots is something that a family member did to help their mom find their room because all of the doors on the hall were white like that. Shadow boxes are a great way to help personalize space also. But, but what I found, I mean, there have been studies on shadow boxes and they have been helpful. But what I have found is that family often put a lot of things in those shadow boxes and they become very cluttered, and there's not a main salient object that stands out that the person really recognizes as their own. So a lot of communities that have shadow boxes still have wayfinding problems because there's not something there that really pops out at the person that says, oh, that's mine. Instead, it becomes kind of visual noise. There's really too much in there to look at. So you have to be careful with that. Next, please. So being able to bring your own things in from home really makes a difference with wayfinding and being able to recognize your space. And of course, having that space feel like home. Next. Just another example of a personalized room. Next. So another design guideline and strategy is optimizing visual aspects of the environment. Lighting, making sure there's adequate lighting, and there are lighting guidelines for senior living. And so we really, again, when I do an environmental assessment, I take a light meter and spend time really looking at the light levels in the environment. You want to add task lighting. Lighting should be non-glare. You want to look at glare both from light coming in windows and be able to have shears or blinds that you can close, and then glare from the lights. Very often there's a lot of glare in the hallways in senior living communities, and there's reflection then off of the floor. So you have to look for indirect glare and direct glare. So indirect glare would be like a light from above shining down onto the table and causing kind of this halo effect on the table, or shining from the floor and then shining down on the floor and then reflecting up. And it causes these odd spots on the floor that if you have visual perceptual problems, it's going to make it difficult for you. Older adults need about 3 times more light. So they really need much brighter light than you would think. And then we'll talk about some of these other things as we go in the next slides. Next, please. So visual organization, having things labeled. Labeling things in the bathroom, in the kitchen, making sure that everything has its home, making sure that things are in line of sight so people can find what they need. So in a home environment, sometimes that means taking off a cabinet door or 2 in the kitchen and organizing, reducing what's there, and then labeling everything to let people know where things go. So frequently used items can be accessed easily. All activity material should be out and accessible instead of locked up in cabinets. People should be able to go to things, have something labeled, have it in a container, a tray, a box, and be able to go and choose things that they want to work on. Next, please. Having things organized and reduced so there's not as many options, and then using color to help items to be distinguished from one another, and then using templates that people can follow will also help them be more independent. So an example of a template would be this placemat. Someone will know where they can put the napkin, the knife, the fork, the spoon. Okay. Having things organized so that if people are going to set the table in your community, maybe all the forks are in one container and they can take that plastic container to the table and place all of the forks down in the same place, and then all of the knives down in the same place. So I work with communities that want to implement Montessori programming, and we always try to engage residents in as many of these household tasks as possible. They use procedural memory, which is a preserved ability. They're familiar tasks to them. They're things that happen every day, so they can be repeated, so they can get better and better at them. And the environment then needs to be supportive of those tasks. So it's one thing if you want to do those activities with individuals, but then the environment needs to be set up so the materials are organized and visible and accessible. Next, please. So for example, participating in cleaning up the community. If you're going to have people sweeping the floor and dusting, you need to let them know that they're invited to do that. So we use invitation signs, and that then the material you see contrasts from the wall, and it's hung at a height and in a location that's easy to access. Next, please. So I can't stress enough how important color contrast is. That's what helps you to distinguish between different types of objects. The bathroom is the most important place to make sure that you're using contrast. And I would say the table setting, the dining room, kitchen, table area is the next place that you really need to pay attention to contrast. So older adults are going to need at least 3 times as much contrast as a younger person. That's a healthy older adult. People with dementia may need even more to be able to see objects from one another. So you think of really looking at the entire room, the entire environment. Where can you add contrast? Next. So contrast in the bathroom is critical, making sure that those fixtures really pop and that they don't blend in with the surroundings, making sure that the toilet paper stands out, towels stand out, they can find what they need. Next. Having contrast with activity materials. So a high contrast invitation with materials that are organized in a tray or container, so what you're working on really stands out and they can see it easily. Next. Signage. So I've done a lot of work with signage. I am a co-investigator of a 5-year NIH-sponsored clinical trial right now, and we are specifically looking at signage in long-term care. I'm designing all of the signs in this wayfinding study, and we're using very colorful, high contrast signs with easy to identify icons that have been tested that we know people will respond to. It's important that you use a large sans serif type. So in your signage, you don't want any little hooks. You want to use something that's an Arial or Helvetica or Calibri, something like that. Nothing that's loopy. And very simple graphics. So we usually design directional signs, location signs, directories, and then bedroom signs. Next, please. Minimize glare, I mentioned this. So here's a good example. You can see both glare on the floor there, and if somebody's sitting by the window and those shades are open, they're going to be receiving direct glare from the window as well. Next. Minimize patterns on the floor. When you have light and dark contrast on the floor, things look like they're at different depths. Things like this could look like they're moving. If you've ever seen anyone bend down and try and pick things up off the floor or step over things, you really want to minimize any kind of pattern on the floor. Next. I did a study a number of years ago that looked at contrast at the table setting. And we had a very low budget, just $250. We improved lighting and we improved contrast at the table setting. We had statistically significant improvements in intake and functional abilities during meals just from very simple, inexpensive changes that we made at the mealtime. Next. I also did a study that looked at the difference between white plates, yellow plates, and red plates with 45 people it was a 6-month study. And we had a slight decrease in intake with yellow plates, not statistically significant. We had a slight increase in intake with the red plates, again, not significant. So they had a month with white plates, then a month with yellow plates, then a month with red plates. I think it was more like 6 weeks. So it changed when the menu cycle changed. But after that, we went back to the white plates and we increased the lighting in the dining room, and we had statistically significant increases in intake. So I've found time and time again that increasing lighting really increases a lot of outcomes. You get a lot of positive outcomes when you have adequate lighting in the environment. Next, please. Here's some examples of labeling and adding contrast so people can control ambient conditions, lighting, heating, things like that. You can have light switches that contrast, or you can have switch plates that contrast, and certainly simple labels for things like thermostats are very helpful. Next. And then controlling ambient noise. So really looking at ways to minimize background noise. So for example, if care is going on in rooms, you wouldn't want to be vacuuming in the hallways during that time. I work with a fiber artist that's made a number of really beautiful interactive quilts for us for long-term care settings. And whenever you can hang something soft fabric like this on the wall, not only is it interesting from a sensory perspective, but also it reduces reverberation. So it will absorb the sound in the room. So we use a lot of things like this, both to make the environment stimulating and to reduce noise in the environment. Next, please. So just to give you a few examples, if I was able to ask you to all unmute yourself and chime in, I would, but it's tricky here, so I'm just going to kind of talk you through it. If you look at these pictures, what are the barriers that you see here in the physical environment? So right off, I would say we have poor lighting in these environments. We have no contrast. Good. Yes, feel free to type in. It does pop up, at least some of them do, and I can see it. Yep, lighting is bad, contrast is bad. If you look at the picture on the right, can you find the toilet paper? It's very hard to find the toilet paper on the picture on the right. There's nothing labeled. The toilet paper is actually behind that shower chair, which is a shower chair, which really shouldn't be used over the toilet, right? There's not a lot of space to get in there to assist someone. I think it's kind of scary looking on the left with the way the toilet seat looks with the black toilet seat there sticking up out of it. There's the towels are covering. Yep, there's too much on the top of the toilet. It's cluttered. Yep. So these are two very real bathrooms from projects that I worked on. And then next, what do we have next here? Okay, so these are solutions that the community came up with by themselves. This was the bathroom on the left. So they painted the wall, but this is a very tiny bathroom. Instead of painting the whole room a contrasting color, they painted the wall below, so the fixtures really pop now. They got the towels off the grab bar. They put in a grab bar that contrasts from the wall. They put a cabinet in and labeled it with the person's name. They have a visual cue at the sink to help the person remind the person to wash their hands. It says clean hands feel good. So it's very positive, and they've labeled the soap dispenser. So really easy, low-cost fixes here. This like it has a totally different feel now. Next slide, please. The bathroom on the left here needs to flip-flop. They've done this beautiful bathroom. It was newly remodeled, and they have no contrast between the wall and the toilet. Okay. On the other picture, they counteracted this with a colored toilet seat. Okay, so that does help. But you really should have the dark down below and the light on top. Next slide. Barriers here. This is the door to a resident's bathroom in their room. Okay, how do you know it's even the bathroom? There's a magnet on the door with a pharmacy phone number on it, which probably the person's not going to be calling or using themselves. The lighting is terrible. Yep, it needs contrast. I think it looks a little dangerous there, like you could get caught between the two doors. Ideally, the door handles should be lever handles, so they're easier to open. So there's even just changing out the hardware, putting in a new light fixture and adding some paint would make a world of difference right here. Putting a label, a sign that lets the person know that's the toilet. Next, please. Right, so here we have a sign that clearly contrasts from the door. It lets someone know it's the toilet. You have a universal design lever handle. You have nice trim around the door so it stands out. This is a much better bathroom door. My all-time biggest pet peeve is communities that put notes for staff out in the environment. First of all, this one here on the left looks atrocious. It kind of communicates to the staff that you don't think they have the sense enough to remember things. It also looks terrible. If you don't want to put it up in your house, you shouldn't put it up in anybody else's house. And here, these other signs are actually on the right for residents, and it's not clear. There's too small print. You don't know what that is. Next. Compared to large print, colorful, simple graphics at every decision-making point, so people know where they need to go. They can find what they're looking for. Next. Rooms should also be decorated so people can get a cue about what's going on in that room, so they know what to expect. So dining rooms should clearly look like their meals happen in that space. This is a music room, and this community's done a very nice job with putting decor in the environment that lets you know that's what happens in the space. Next, please. You take a look at this room, this hallway. Think about some of the barriers that you see here. The lighting is dim. There's no contrast. Doesn't feel comfortable or warm or homey at all. There's no wayfinding cues to let you know where to go. Yep, someone said it's boring colors. So this is very often what I see is a very long hall and doors on either side and nothing interesting to engage in. Or if the hallway does have artwork, it's kind of very generic looking that you might find in a hotel or something. It's not something that's conversation piece or may be interesting to the residents. So as someone just commented, it becomes very institutional looking then. Next, please. So if you look at barriers here, we see this kind of display often too. There's glare, It's very busy, so your eye doesn't know where to rest. The print is very small. Okay? They might have had very good intentions, but it wasn't executed in a way that's really supportive. Also on the left-hand side are two posters that are employee assistance program posters. One says, "Do you need help?" Yes, we're legally required to post things, but if we have to post things that are for the staff, they should be in the most out of way possible that we can meet our regulations as an out of the way for the residents in a place that the staff can see them if they need to access that information. But the residents don't need that information, so it shouldn't be in their home environment. So some of the solutions that we use are room signs that have a picture that the resident recognizes of themselves. Now, this is just a stock photo clip art picture, but what I would use is a picture that I have tested that the resident recognizes as themselves. So they see that and they really know that that's them. And so most of the time, that's going to be a picture of them from the past, not a picture of them now. They're going to recognize themselves with maybe on their wedding day or with their favorite pet. And then a clear label of their name. Often we'll frame these in a large 8x10 frame and place them right on their door or just to the side of their door. I find these types of signs are much more effective than a small little name written on a piece of paper slid in those plastic signs. And then the communities that I work with, we all wear single name tags, residents and staff. I use a 3" by 1.5" name tag. No, it's not a HIPAA violation to have a picture with their name. Thanks for asking, but that's something that people are often confused about. And having a name tag for both residents and staff allows the residents to clearly see and identify the staff member and engage them by name, but it also allows the residents to engage each other by name. And that's important. I mean, when we change over often to resident name tags, the residents say things to me like, "I've been sitting across from this person for all of these years, and I never knew who they were." Someone just said, what would the resident name tags be made out of? I'll address that question real quick. So typically we use very heavy duty magnets for anyone that doesn't have a pacemaker. So we don't have to deal with pins, and they're a little easier than clips. For people who have a pacemaker, we often use clips. We try and stay away from the plastic pockets because they have glare. There's several name tag companies that have kits that you can buy that you can print out your own name tags on paper and snap them together with a plastic cover that have very little glare. There's also name tag companies that make name tags that are heavy duty and they're engraved. So there are a lot of options out there, and I recommend those. Next slide, please. Any kind of interactive art that you can do on the walls in the halls to make them more interesting, it really will help with conversation and will help with wayfinding as well. And next slide. So thank you. I didn't leave too much time for questions here, but I hope as I saw you type them in that I was able to answer a few. My email is on that last slide. It's jennifer@brushdevelopment.com. If you have any questions, please feel free to get in touch. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. This was amazing. A quick comment is I'm always impressed by the diversity and impact of your work and what it can potentially do for people in the senior care and senior living environment. You're right, we probably don't have time for questions and answers, but I invite anyone to consider reaching out to Jennifer or us, and we'll direct the questions to everyone. Lastly, but as always, everyone's invited to participate in our discussion about the fact that all people are cool at allpeopleare.cool. Here are Jennifer and my contacts, and lastly, wanted to share with you the agenda for the rest of the year. Again, don't have much time to cover that. I'll leave Megan kind of address the administrative piece. And again, Jennifer, thank you so much for sharing this wonderful presentation today.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Everyone, you'll see that the survey link has now been posted in the Zoom webinar chat box, but I will also be sending out an email. It's coming through Constant Contact in the next hour to everyone who attended the full live session today. Take a look in your spam inbox just to be sure you don't miss it. And if you want CEU credit, again, please fill out that survey no later than midnight this Thursday, and your CEU certificates will be issued on Friday of this week. Thank you very much for your time today, and we hope to see everyone in September.
Take care, everyone. Thank you again, Jennifer. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.